like, honestly, do you really believe that NATO countries are going to start launching missiles into Moscow? Like, do you really believe that, or is this something you're worried 20 or 30 years from now? Or do you think that the investment into ABM technology is going to become so good that, at some point we did it, guys, we beat second strike capability, time to just nuke the hell out of Russia? That sounds fantastical to me. Now, maybe we can imagine a world where that happens, but I can't use that imaginary world to justify the invasion, destruction of civilian cities, and the takeover of a sovereign nation that exists today in the real world.
I think this is more justifiable than the American war in Iraq. I think this is more justifiable than the NATO intervention in Libya. I think it's more justifiable than the American war in Afghanistan, frankly. I support Russia. Go Russia! We salute the brave soldiers, the Moscow's finest, the Tsar's finest, as they liberate Ukraine from the Western dogs.
If I grant almost everything you've said, let's say that I grant that Russia has a legitimate security interest in having Ukraine be a vassal state or part of their big union. Let's say that I do grant that. Why would Russia's security interests there supersede Ukraine's sovereignty to make decisions for themselves? Why, how would you tell an entire country, like, listen, we know you guys want to look more west, we know you want into these free trade agreements, but we can't do that because Daddy Russia's scared, so you kind of just have to cuck yourselves eternally to that country. Good luck.
Yeah, see, I've heard that argument before, and it's this question of security versus sovereignty. And, unfortunately, I think the consequence of, this NATO expansion and everything is that Zelensky was emboldened. The question is, to me, whether there's sovereignty or security, I think is sort of an abstract question. The question is, why is Russia currently in Ukraine? Well, I guess you would say that, Russia having some kind of control over Ukraine at all or influence over Ukraine at all compromises their sovereignty in favor of Russia's security. I would say this is just how great powers behave. This is unfortunately, fortunately or unfortunately, this is just how the world is. The question is, how do we prevent conflict in Ukraine? Why are there currently people dying? Why is there a war going on? And that is because NATO has expanded and emboldened Zelensky, and they have not negotiated with Russia. Now Russia has had to undertake something which, they've had to demonstrate what a sphere of influence is really about, which is there's an underlying threat of the use of force. I agree with you in some sense that, Ukraine must be a vassal state for Russia to have its security, but this is how great powers operate. This is how the entire Western Hemisphere is organized. This is how Western Europe is organized.
If that's the response, then why can't I just? So I'm looking for some normative.
That's a huge difference too. In the talk with Sargon, we were talking about the difference, the imperialistic difference between the American empire and the Russian empire, and we don't need vassal states to ensure our security. We're not doing that, correct?
I mean, the counter to that would be, well, we do. I mean, because we don't have a threat in our hemisphere, a physical threat. We're not afraid of Canada or some South American country from invading us, right?
Right.
But I think that the real difference here, which we got into with Sargon, is how we're defining vassal states. And I don't think it's fair to say that, the American empire is just countries working with us because they're kind of aligned with us culturally and economically. And I don't think that compares to sort of the Russian empire, which is, we're literally installing a puppet to be in control of your country. I don't think that's a fair comparison to say these are the same things.
To deliver resources to Russian oligarchs.
Right, exactly. To deliver, to extract the resources from your country and just give them to our oligarchs, which America has done in the past. And I violently disagree with that. But I don't think America is operating under that model at all anymore. It hasn't been for quite some time. Well, right now we're more concerned about creating markets.
Yeah, the socialists would come in and they would say, well, that's the same thing. The market is the same thing. You're basically giving the resources over to Exxon Mobil instead of some oligarch. And Exxon Mobil is just really an oligarch. And we're
that's because they don't want an American company to enter a country and to create jobs via whatever the natural resources is, because that government doesn't have the money or the infrastructure to create their own gas company or whatever, to create their own gas pros, because they view, since from a socialist perspective, since they view the company as inherently oppressive because it's not a co-op, then yeah, they see it as exactly the same thing as Russia coming in or some other country coming in and just extracting the resources and taking it. But I mean, I think that's obviously a completely ridiculous false equivalence.
But ExxonMobil would pay the nation for the mineral rights.
Right, and would pay the people that work there.
Yeah, but the problem is, though, in these 10-pot dictatorships,
that the people they're paying,
they pay the elites.
Right,
the money never filters down to the populace.
Right.
Who has to live with the pollution and all the external
the
costs.
issue, that's completely true. But the issue is that that's not America or ExxonMobil's fault. They can't do anything. As we've learned from Iraq and Afghanistan, you can't go in and force a country to be a liberal Western democracy.
Right. But if we're paying mineral rights, wouldn't we rather pay them to a non-corrupt regime that was going to use those earnings to better their population?
Of course.
Yeah.
Of course.
That's a huge difference. I feel like people just fundamentally disagree with that idea that America wants that. I think a lot of people believe that America would rather deal with a 10-pot dictator that's just going to subjugate his people than to deal with a democracy.
So that idea comes from a very specific time period when America had a lot of companies or American companies or interest in South American or Central American countries. It was countering, there were socialist movements, some of which were funded by Soviet Union, some of which were not. There were these socialist movements that basically wanted to come in, overthrow the government, and steal basically the infrastructure and assets that private companies had built, which is what they did in Cuba, and, quote unquote, nationalize the resource. And so from the socialist perspective, they think that's the moral thing to do. And that's the ethical thing to do. So that's where all that feeling and all that thought is coming from. And I don't think that's even remotely applicable to the world today, where we don't have, all these, socialist revolutions being fermented and running around in South America that, that America's worried about. But they're still operating. It seems like socialists they're stuck in like the 60s and they can't move beyond that. Like all their thinking is stuck in that time frame.
Yeah. Sucks.
Activity from you, not just descriptions. But if we are just going to go on descriptions, you can't really then attack NATO for continuing to expand, because I would just utter the same back to you. Well, this is just what the United States would do. Of course, we'd want to expand our sphere of influence and include Ukraine into NATO. But at that point, you're not really left with being able to defend Russia's actions any more than I would defend NATO's actions, including Ukraine.
Well, here's what I would say the difference is that for Russia, Ukraine is a vital security interest. For NATO, Ukraine is not a vital security interest. And that really is where the difference lies, is that, once again, when you consider that, and you could say that, well, Ukraine has a right to join the NATO alliance, they may prefer.
Which I would say,
there's a plurality of people in Ukraine who want Ukraine to be a NATO member state. But what exactly does this do for the United Kingdom? What exactly, and really more fundamentally, what does this how does this benefit the United States of America? Because ultimately the NATO defensive alliance and security guarantee is built on the.
You're muted if you're talking.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. I think this is accepting.
What the fuck?
I think this is accepting Russia's framing of the situation incorrectly. Because, as I said, it's not. First of all, the situation started with them wanting to have close relations with the EU, not join NATO. That's what started all this. And it's not like it's easy for Russia to make the argument like, "Oh, what does U.S. have to do with this? They're across the water." But it's like, okay, but we're not talking about just the U.S. interest. We're talking a lot about European interest, and they're right there. They're just on the other. They're on the other border. They're right on the other side of that. And so they have just as viable a concern as Russia does in terms of who's on whose border.
Yeah, no. Yeah. I mean, they got to figure it out themselves.
American military or anything else, more than the paltry contributions of Germany, France, and the United Kingdom. It's about the American defense guarantee. And so the question is, as far as Russia intervening, this is a defensive act shoring up a vital security interest. NATO expansion into Slovenia, Croatia, Ukraine.
That's the justification right there. He says this is a defensive act, and that's morally speaking, we understand. I mean, we argued for months about Kyle Rittenhouse. Why did we argue about Kyle Rittenhouse? Fucking self-defense.
Right. But
yeah.
I think part of what I don't think Destiny did, fleshed out in the beginning of this conversation. I think they get into it later, but it's just that the security threat the supposed security threat that NATO poses to Russia doesn't seem to have been materialized at all.
Mm-hmm.
As we talked about in our conversation with Sargon, definitely hasn't materialized now. And it doesn't seem to be anyone thinks that there's going to be some hot war between NATO and Russia at any point in the near future where NATO invades Russia. So what exactly is the security threat?
Right. Well, the security threat cannot exist and him believe that it exists, and it still pose some sort of peril towards the situation.
Right. That's true. But that's why I laid out my alternative theory here, because I don't think Putin does believe that NATO is going to invade Russia. I think this is more about he's afraid of getting Gaddafi. He needs foreign powers that would aid him in the case of some kind of revolution or civil war.
Yeah.
Or obviously I think this is mostly just an economic thing too, not really like a military thing. He's afraid of Ukraine threatening his oil dominance in Europe.
Right. And he's afraid of being Venezuela, obviously.
Yes.
The country fully dependent on natural resources. The only way to get out of that trap, though, is to develop a vibrant economy, like a dynamic economy that's going to engage in creative destruction. And how do you do that from an autocracy? You just can't.
You can't. Right. And that's the central issue here, is that Putin's form of government cannot create a vibrant economy at all.
Yeah.
Structurally.
Yes. It was so disheartening to hear the defeatist attitude of the great Carl Benjamin that we just have to settle. Uh-huh. It is what it is, Adam. Why? I mean, Carl is far more of an idealist than me.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, can't we push him in that direction just a teeny bit? And what's wrong with that?
Right.
He did admit that it was ultimately better for Japan, which I think, okay, then ultimately it would be better for Russia.
We just got to nuke Russia. That's all it was.
Well, no, I think we could spare the nuke part of it, but ultimately, moving towards that path.
Yeah.
How is this, and I guess I would throw it back to you, why is this a vital security interest for the NATO countries, and more specifically the United States, which underlies the whole security guarantee?
Well, so firstly, it doesn't have to be a vital security interest. The membership into NATO is contingent upon a country wanting to join, and then contingent upon NATO membership countries wanting countries to join. It doesn't necessarily have to represent a security interest for everybody to allow countries into the fold, right? We would argue, like, did the Baltic states represent like an actual security interest for the rest of Europe? Did any of Southern, like, did these countries need to join NATO to shore up the security of Europe? Other people might argue that the broader peace enjoyed by Europe might be because of the expansion of NATO, that it's hard to attack a country that is under this umbrella, this guarantee of safety and peace. Other people might say, if we start seeing massive excursion or massive fleeings of refugees and everything from Ukraine, they might point to that and go, oh, well, look, there's the security interest. Similar to when we had the massive fleeing of Syrians from Syria and we had a refugee crisis across all Europe. Well, now we have refugees fleeing from Ukraine because of actions that Russia is taking into Ukraine. I noticed that when you frame this conversation a lot, I'm not blaming you for this, but it's often framed as like an issue between Russia and the United States security interest. What is the Russian security interest? What is the United States security interest? What about Ukraine's security interest, right? If we talk to any of the other Eastern European NATO member states, like, oh, well, like, how are the Baltics feeling right now? You know, how are Poland, how are Romania, how are you guys feeling right now? They're probably feeling pretty good. They're probably feeling a lot more secure. If you were to ask Ukraine, I imagine they would probably feel pretty secure as well. They probably wouldn't have to worry about their ports being taken over by Russians, breakaway states being recognized as independent. I think it's worth addressing. So to answer your question, like in one, the security interest isn't necessarily relevant. That's not a requirement to join NATO. But two, if we are going to talk about security interests, I think we should be able to talk about the Ukrainian security interests, which is keeping their country free of Russian meddling.
Well, and I think that's actually, I mean, to ask the question is to answer it. What is Ukraine's security interest? You know, Ukraine's not very secure right now, right? I mean, Russia is invading Ukraine. Russia is currently bombing Ukraine and involved in a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And so, you know, what was Zelensky daring Russia to intervene? You know, when Zelensky goes to the Munich security...
Yeah, but they're not part of NATO. It's just making the argument that they should have joined, that America should have had them be part of NATO.
Yeah, again and again and again. They keep...
Like, well, that's why this is weird. Because, like, in 2008, say, if George Bush got his way and Ukraine was put on the path to NATO membership, and they were admitted 2 years later in 2010, you know, then none of this would have happened.
Yeah.
Russia wouldn't have lashed out against Ukraine.
Because they'd be in NATO already.
Because they'd be in NATO, yeah.
Yeah.
I don't like that it's equivalently talked about that, like, well, like Ukraine's security interest is to not be fucked with, and Russia's security interest is to continue to fuck with. So I'm going to be a little bit more lenient on the side of Ukraine that doesn't want to be invaded, that doesn't want its territorial integrity constantly threatened, that doesn't want, which I am glad at least you acknowledge, that like all of those Eastern separatist groups are fully funded and backed by Russian militaries, right? Lithuania doesn't have these problems. Estonia doesn't have these problems, right? You don't have these problems in countries that have joined NATO. And when you're Ukrainian and you look to the north and you look to the west and you look and you see these countries are in NATO, don't have to worry about Russia coming over to threaten your territorial integrity. I don't understand how we can say that there isn't a vital security interest there for Ukraine unless you're literally saying, well, there's not because, look, Russia made it not, right? I don't know if that's necessarily a fair thing to say, that they don't have a security interest because now Russia is afraid of them dealing with their security interests. We talk about like it's so ironic, and this is another thing that's ultra ironic too, is we talk about like, well, NATO is an organization without purpose. It was created to only contain the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, and in '91 it should have been disbanded. You know, people say that. Other people say, well, maybe the expansion of NATO can ensure greater periods of peace and prosperity for Europe, which arguably it has. But now, today, you have countries like Sweden and in Finland talking about potentially joining NATO just because of how aggressive Russia's been acting. So while you might say on one hand, like, well, look, it's not in the security interest of Ukraine because now Russia's attacking them. I could say on the other hand, well, look, this isn't in the interest of Russia because now everybody else wants to join NATO. It feels like, and even if you are pro-Russian, you have to acknowledge that today the NATO alliance is probably stronger than it ever has been. There has been like a revitalization across even NATO skeptic countries like France, even Germany that was unwilling to go as far with some of these sanctions and military equipment, even Poland that initially didn't want to contribute as much. These countries have been revitalized in purpose, united against Russia, to where if Russia doesn't succeed in Ukraine, or even if they do succeed in Ukraine, it feels like now all they've done is create a stronger NATO. I feel like something that the United States has done a decent job of, say...
I mean, and, you know, that's a good point. You know, if Nick's going to say the proof is in the pudding, for Ukraine is worse off now because they're currently being invaded, then you could say, well, Russia's going to be worse off because all, you know, Finland and all these other countries are clamoring to join NATO now. And on top of that, and this is part of why I completely disagree with, you know, Mishmeyer's analysis here, is that he thinks that all countries are basically operating under this, you know, we have to protect our borders, we have to protect our sovereignty with military force at their core. And that's why the quote unquote liberal order will never work. But that doesn't seem to be the case because Europe and Japan, a lot of other countries, you know, they complain about America being the world police, but they actually love America being the world police because then they don't have to spend money on their military. And this actually comes up later in the conversation where Nick says, you know, oh, you know, Japan's been trying to, you know, part of the agreement with Japan after World War II was that they couldn't, you know, create their own military. And Nick is saying, oh, Japan is still under the thumb of America. They want to create their own military. But it's actually the reverse when I looked into it. Because first of all, America and the rest of the world has basically been allowing Japan to build up its military forces as long as they call them, security forces, massive finger quotes. And it's basically looked the other way in Japan for decades now. And it's actually the opposite. America has been trying to get Japan
to spend more money,
to increase its military spending because of China. And Japan's kind of like they're dragging their feet because they don't want to spend the money on it because they're like, fuck, we've had 60 years or so of being able to not spend money on our fucking expensive military. And it's the same thing with Europe. There's so many of these European countries have been basically skimping on military for themselves because they kind of felt like, well, this is the end of history. The liberal hegemony is here, and we don't have to worry about being invaded anymore.
It's a good neighborhood. We don't have to lock our doors. We're safe here.
That's exactly the perfect comparison. All these people were like, listen, we're in this good neighborhood because America, is fucking
the police.
Policing the
They're
beat.
on the beat.
Right. And then you get the Russians moving,
Yeah.
And Putin, starts, breaking into someone else's house, and everyone's like completely thinking about the world in a completely different way. And all these countries are all clamoring to now build up their militaries again.
Right. Yeah.
I guess the argument is just that Putin just completely miscalculated. I mean, there's all this thing about like, oh, the West completely miscalculated Putin. I guess Putin completely 100% miscalculated the West response either.
Everyone's saying that.
Right. But but the Russian apologists seem to ignore that fact.
Yeah.
Maybe Putin thought this was going to be the Georgia, Crimea again, where he was just going to be able to go swoop in and take part of the country and everyone's just going to kind of shrug, but that didn't happen this time.
Yeah. For Iraq, at least, it feels like exerting soft power instead of this hard power, this idea that you need to invade and take over everything, maybe would have been a better route to go for Russia rather than I'm going to Sevastopol, I'm going to Crimea, I'm stealing your base, I'm funding these separatists, and I'm going to invade the fuck out of your country if you don't do exactly what I say. I feel like the era for that politics is past, and all Russia has done with their current actions is undermine the security of all of Europe, revitalize NATO, and threaten Ukraine's sovereignty for no real justification of its own other than they want control of that piece of land.
Putting the soft power paradigm and the hard power paradigm on the same level, that blows my mind. But
I don't
that's
think it's
basically
fair.
what Carl did when he was talking about what Sargon did.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's why I don't think it's fair to say that like, oh, there's a NATO empire that's the same as like the Russian empire.
Yes.
Even if we remove Russia's hard power excursion right now, I still don't think it's fair to compare the soft power of NATO or America or the EU on Ukraine or any of these other Eastern European countries compared to Russia, because it's literally the opposite paradigm. And the EU deal is the literal perfect example of this. In order to have this EU deal, Ukraine had to become less corrupt, had to have stronger regulations to fight corruption. And the EU was only going to give them, significantly less money in loans. They weren't going to just give them some giant payday. And Russia's like, you don't have to change any of your laws. You can still be as corrupt as you want, and we'll give you a massive payment.
So,
what does that tell you?
Versus student aid.
Right, but what does that tell you? It shows you that the EU's position was basically like, well, if you want to join us, you have to work for it. You have to change and do this to join us. And Russia's like trying to buy you off. That's why I don't think it's fair to categorize like, oh, Russia and NATO or Russia and EU have like this, or like on the same level of trying to buy off Ukraine or any of these other countries.
Right.
It's a completely different game that's being played here. And I agree with Carl that, from the Russian perspective, a lot of it is them trying to like grasp at the glory days that have gone by. But should all these other countries suffer for the sake of Russia being able to live in the past? And I think the answer to that is no.
Even with the economic aid and stuff, and if it's in the form of IMF loans, the selfish incentive is that they want to be paid back. They want interest on their investments. So that's why they want to fight the corruption in Ukraine.
Right.
But what Putin wants is loyalty. Like he's just basically paying bribes to
Right. Yeah, that's a good point.
for loyalty, which is just a completely different paradigm. I don't see if Russia was willing to play in this soft market, in the soft power paradigm, go for it. Like I'm in favor of that.
Right. Well, but that's the issue here is that this is why, I mean, I don't buy, Russia used to be, a world power. And I don't buy the idea that when the Soviet Union collapsed, that Russia, with its vast oil and gas reserves, couldn't have become, have a functioning economy that could be on somewhat equal footing, if not equal footing, with the EU or America in terms of, having influence with its neighbors. I don't buy that. And I think the only reason they're in the position in the economic straits that they're in right now is because, as you said, of Putin's mismanagement of the country.
Yeah.
And because the country, when I read that paper by the American analyst during the fall of the Soviet Union, which was very sad, which is saying, Russia, and this is completely agrees with Carl's position, which I think is true, is that Russia just didn't have the culture of wanting to, or the culture of its population, having respect for laws, having respect for institutions and markets. It had a culture of corruption from the Soviet era, and they're still working, and I think they're still working off of that culture. Or Putin, I think that culture could have changed, but Putin decided that he's going to maintain that culture for his own benefit.
Yeah, that's why I wanted to get that in when we were talking with Carl, because it really is a mismanagement issue. Ryan Chapman has a great video called The Rise of China. Have you watched that video?
Yeah, Ryan. Yeah, he does. All his videos are great.
Yeah. So this video, I had no idea, but he basically lays out how China went from being, starving 30 years ago to being, a superpower, right? Arguably the US's biggest competitor. And I had no idea that the Chinese Communist Party sent people out to live in all kinds of different nations to see how things were done and to set up some kind of culture that would work for China. And there was a debate over whether or not they could do it incrementally or like shock and awe style, flip the switch. And ultimately they decided incrementalism was the way to go. And they've actually done kind of incremental change, testing things out in certain provinces and seeing if it worked or not before they implement it all over the country, which is just, I mean, it's like a bureaucratic management system to bring their nation into the modern era in a way that Putin just has never even engaged with.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. No,
it's night and day.
Right. No, and that's true. I mean, and Mark Ledwich has talked about this, and he's saying that basically the way China runs its country is that it views each region as like a financial experiment, and it's going to like test different models in each region and then copy what works and kind of iterate off of that. And I mean, as you said, Putin is not interested in doing anything like that at all.
No.
For himself. So, I mean, and with China, I mean, I think China is still, I think the government of China is still evil. They're engaged in the Uyghur genocide. I think they're the closest to a 1984 style country that exists currently in the world. But but they did change. And so why I kind of don't buy the fatalistic idea that like Russia could never change. And so and did seem like other leaders of Russia did want to change.
Yeah. Boris Yeltsin was moving in that direction.
Yeah, Yeltsin, Gorbachev.
Oh, Gorbachev
even
as well. Yeah.
Medvedev seemed like Medvedev was like super enamored with Obama. He wanted to be Obama, which is kind of hilarious.
Wow. I don't know much about Medvedev.
Well, it's kind of funny because since he was like always viewed as Putin's puppet, basically, he saw Obama's charisma and the fact that people he's like, I wish people liked me for me, basically. It's kind of hilarious. He's kind of like a character from a movie or like a teenage sitcom. He's like, I wish people loved me for me the way they love Obama. And so that's why he was partially open to a lot of, being more favorable with the West. Even though immediately after Obama was elected, they put nukes in the middle of Europe to see what he would do. But
Oh, shit.
listen, Russia's never provoked America. Okay, never happened. It's all NATO expansion.
The comparison is just totally unfair. If Ukraine chooses to be pressured by joining those types of free trade agreements, by joining those types of NATO alliances, I feel like that mounts the pressure onto you then to answer. If there is so much pressure from Washington militarily, if there's so much pressure from Brussels economically, if there's so much pressure from all these Western institutions, why is Ukraine so eager to join them? Clearly, there must be mounting pressure in the opposite direction as well, right? And we're comparing on the Western hand, like the ability to join these free trade agreements, and then on the Eastern hand, the forcible entry into customs unions that would heavily restrict your trade because now you've got shared external tariffs and everything. The idea that there is some like massive pressure from the West that threatens your sovereignty in a way that there isn't from the East, when Ukraine seems to be like eagerly trying to join the West, just doesn't make sense. Why? Like their actions and the desire of their population just doesn't seem to speak to that idea that there's so much horrible pressure from the West. Something else that I also disagree with, and then you're going to answer this, because all of this keeps getting framed. Now, I said initially, I'll agree with all of that, and then I'll ask you a question about Ukraine. But now I want to challenge the framing of one of these things. We talk about vital security interests. I don't buy it. I don't agree with it. I've seen you talk about the funnel. I've seen other people talk about geography. Historically, Russia's been invaded a number of times through Ukraine. But like, I have to ask you honestly, if Ukraine was to join NATO, do we really think that there are going to be troops invading Russia? Does Putin really think that Ukraine's ascension into NATO means there's going to be some sort of ground invasion or some sort of like threat of force from NATO into Russia? Like, if so, it hasn't happened in the Baltics yet. We haven't seen it anywhere else. Like, what? Like, is there? I disagree that there is an actual security interest in Ukraine. I think that the interest lies more in the rebuilding of the empire and more of Putin establishing his order farther out from Moscow.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say that this is just, it's sort of almost a willfully ignorant position. And I understand if you like guzzle State Department propaganda, I understand why you might say like, well, how could NATO possibly pose a threat to Russia? It says it right here. It's a defensive alliance. Once again, the purpose of NATO, and
So I'm really glad that Destiny brought up those points, because I think, and that's what we brought up a million times, and I think it's a completely valid argument. Unfortunately, Nick kind of vacillates in how he argues about whether he actually he'll engage with in good faith to some extent, but then the second he sort of doesn't have an argument or he's kind of on losing foot, he just immediately switches to kind of debate tactics mode. And so, because the very specific question is, will explain to me what the actual threat is from Ukraine, as opposed to any of the other countries that NATO borders with Russia. And he just pivots to, well, it says it's a defensive treaty. It's like, well, that's nothing to do with what anyone's talking about. That's just an empty, hollow talking point, Nick.
Yeah.
I don't understand why you acknowledge this. The purpose of NATO is to contain Russia and contain.
Like NATO is going to turn over an imperialistic, forceful leaf, and it's going to immediately start taking over the world, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's what we're supposed to infer from this, correct?
Right. That is what we're supposed to infer, I guess.
But according to some, it already is an imperialistic
there you go.
force bent on taking over the entire world. Yeah.
Right.
Means we want to stop Russia. We want to prevent.
So you're going to have to start taking a shot every time he says containment, because
No. If you did that, we'd all die of alcohol poisoning. Don't do that.
What the fuck? There's this thing called international law that is supposed to contain people, right? Stay within your borders. Don't invade your neighbors, right? Isn't that a thing that everyone kind of agrees to? Not Russia. No, we don't want to do that. We don't like to be contained.
The influence of Russia, that's a hostile action. Okay, and we're aimed at
saying stay within your borders. That's a hostile action, Sitch. That's very hostile. Okay. That's totally against the rules.
Staying
creating
within your
a
borders,
sort of
I know.
wanting to trade with other countries. These are very hostile actions.
I know.
Yes.
Very
This is-
threatening. Very
Yes, this is
scary.
thank you. This is the soft imperialism of Ukraine and NATO.
Yeah.
circle around Russia. We want to contain, that's what NATO is for. And NATO is more than 10-1 more powerful than Russia. And so NATO then moving into the Black Sea, moving into Crimea, moving into Ukraine, 100 kilometers from Moscow, just by its very existence, this presents a security threat to Russia. You could say all you want, well, I can't imagine a scenario. Well, American leaders talk about this stuff all the time. I mean, ever since the Russian incursion into Crimea and their support for the Donbass, we hear from American leaders, they say, Putin's a killer, Putin's a thug, Putin's a dictator. We know that it is the wet dream of the neocons and of the Council on Foreign Relations and the State Department to depose Putin. This is why Western agencies back Putin's opponents like Navalny and some of the opposition parties. We know that this is what America does. They spy on Russia. We know that we back the anti-Putin resistance. It's the wet dream.
Yeah, but none of this is answering the question at all. How does this manifest in Ukraine at all? How does the physical location of Ukraine change any of the things that you're talking about? He hasn't answered this. That the entire core of his argument is that Ukraine represents a security threat, and he hasn't explained how it does. Just that it does.
Yeah, I hear those missiles fly like a distance. Can't they just launch them from Germany? Why do they have to nuke Moscow from Ukraine?
Yeah,
that seems like a dumb idea.
There's NATO countries on Russia's northeast border.
Right.
Okay. The missiles will fly from there. The missiles will fly from the U.S. The missiles will fly from the submarines that are all over the waters everywhere. The same thing with Russia. Like if the location was such an issue, okay, then why would the U.S. care? Why wouldn't the U.S. just nuke Russia? Why would we be afraid of Russia in a nuclear war? Because we'd say, well, they can't nuke us. We're across the world from them, right?
They can though.
They can though.
Yeah.
So that's why this argument has never materialized.
Right. If they could, we would send troops over there.
Yeah, probably.
We would.
Probably.
Be like, oh, we're safe distance away. Fuck it.
Yeah.
States have a color revolution in Russia, just like they had in Ukraine, just like that in Georgia, just like that in Kazakhstan. And so the idea that we can't possibly fathom a scenario where Russia would be threatened again, more than 10-1. That'd be like if I went outside your house with a tank and a nuclear bomb and a light machine gun, and I came there and said, I fucking hate Destiny. I was like, but don't worry, I'm just here to protect like your neighbors or something. And you're like, oh, well, he said it's defensive. That's okay. Again, you have to look at the history here.
Well, no, it'd be like if you came with a tank outside your house and you said, I'm protecting this house. And for the last 60 years, you've had your tank pointed at them and all their friends. And they've had their tanks pointed at you. And I say, well, what is this one tank being in this one place closer to me? How does that make any difference? What's the difference exactly here?
Yeah. Look, they're trying to contain them. Just
okay. I'm sorry, I forgot.
Contain. They're right to not be contained.
Right. Contain.
Of the Cold War. The antagonism between the West and the East doesn't evaporate.
Well, and also, it doesn't even, like, this argument, Nick's already ceded this argument doesn't even make sense because he's already conceded that it doesn't seem remotely militarily possible for Russia to hold Ukraine, even if they take over it. And if that's true, then this is all a fucking moot point because Russia could go and smash up Ukraine. And NATO, like Ukraine doesn't have to be a NATO member for NATO forces to march through Ukraine to get to Russia. If there is some magical geographic, magic there that they have to have Ukraine. And if Russia can't shore up and defend Ukraine and control it, then this is all moot and this doesn't matter because fucking NATO would just march right through Ukraine. And you think Ukraine after this would care if NATO marched through its country.
No, they'd
into
welcome
Russia?
them. They're begging NATO to come in right now. What are you
Exactly.
talking about?
Yeah, exactly. So none of this argument makes no sense at all from any possible interpretation.
NATO is literally trying to give them jets right now, but they can't find an intermediary that's not going to escalate the situation.
Right.
And his whole argument that NATO doesn't understand the provocation here. I mean, it seems like they do, dealing just with the jet crisis, with the complexities of giving jets to Ukraine. It seems like they don't want to escalate.
It seems like Russia didn't understand the provocation.
Yes. Russia just wants to install a puppet government. That's the whole purpose of this thing. Like if Zelensky was gone, this thing would be over.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
He's probably got a president in waiting in Ukraine, right?
Yeah, I forget. There's some guy I mentioned a couple weeks ago. I said that was the theory of who they think is the guy they want to install.
Right.
He was one of the people that ran away to Russia in 2014.
But he's back. He's riding a tank right now into Kiev. Right?
He's probably waiting in Russia to be helicoptered in, once the situation is clear. But
yeah. What if they shoot down that helicopter? They've been shot down a couple. So.
well, it looks like they got a bunch of spares, running around.
Yeah.
Let's entertain a scenario where Ukraine joins NATO. Because they're still pushing for it, even after the crisis in 2014. Let's say today, what's that?
Of course, yeah.
Yes. Let's say Ukraine becomes a NATO member state. Okay, what do you do? Well, guess what? Crimea is still formally occupied by Russia. Donbass and the civil war between Kiev and Donbass is still ongoing. So what happens then when the government in Kiev is at war with Russian-backed proxies in Donbass? As a consequence of Ukraine joining NATO, you now have a proxy war in Ukraine, a proxy civil war between Russian-backed separatists and a NATO member state. What's more, Kiev does not acknowledge the Russian annexation.
This is why NATO doesn't let nations with contested borders enter NATO. That's one of the criterias. Right. Yeah.
Yeah, I think Destiny brings that up.
Yeah. Of Crimea. I mean, they do not accept this fact. So, now we're in a really bad security spot where, and you could say, oh, well, this would never happen because people would never do this. But I mean, of course, these things can happen. What happens if there's a war between Russia and Ukraine over Crimea? What happens when there's there's this ongoing proxy war between Russian-backed separatists in Donbass and Ukraine?
I mean, he says, what happens if there's a war between Russia and Ukraine over Crimea? That literally is fucking happening.
Right.
What the fuck is he talking about? What happens? It is happening.
And I've heard the argument, people say, Zelensky says, well, NATO's defensive, so Article 5 obligations aren't invoked if we attack Russia or something. But as we know, the fog of war is thick. And as to who started which conflict, of course, it would benefit the Ukrainians to say, oh, well, Russia attacked us. Now we need to fold NATO response in Crimea. The point is, you don't need to be pro-Russian or pro-American. You don't need to be an expert to say that's a really fucked up situation. It is a bad situation to have a NATO member state with disputed territory in Crimea and a proxy civil war in Donbass. Like that is probably the biggest threat to World War III in the entire world. That's probably so that American policymakers would seriously consider this in spite of what's going on. The moment that Russia invaded Crimea, the United States should have said, you know what, it's too complicated. We can't get involved. But even in 2021, they're saying we're going to enhance our strategic partnership. Ukraine will become a part of NATO. It's like, we know that Russia's not giving up Crimea. We know that the thing in Donbass isn't going to be resolved anytime soon. So even if we achieved our aspirations, all this would do is create a situation, a powder keg, that could absolutely lead to World War III, maybe the #1 cause of World War III if that were to happen.
Sure. So just to shoot down the last point very quickly, nations with contested territory can't join NATO. It would never be the case that we would admit Ukraine to join while there is contested territory, unless Ukraine was willing to cede that immediately to Russia. So that's completely off the table right there. In terms of Ukraine...
KO!
Oh man, there's so many arguments to go through. One of the very first thing you talk about how like NATO expanded first. NATO was the aggressor first. I don't know if I necessarily agree with that. When I was searching through, in post Cold War era conflict, right? What's happening in Europe? One of the first conflicts that happened was Russia supporting the breakaway state in Moldova during the Transnistria War. So Russia had already established a pattern of you find separatists, you fund them, you export a fuck ton of Russian passports, you get these people set up and established and they're on breakaway state, you send Russian peacekeeper troops there, and that's literally right on the Ukrainian border. So we've already got a map for what would happen in the future in South Ossetia, in Georgia, and then in what's happening now in Donbass and Ukraine. The idea that NATO is forcing Russia's hands here, when I think Russia has already had the blueprint for this exact type of action, I don't agree with that. I think that Russia has already established that pattern of behavior. In terms of, I feel like everything else is repeating over and over again. I don't even like using the realist analysis. I think it's garbage. I don't think anybody even agrees with using realism to analyze foreign policies anymore. I know that you...
So, my understanding on my cursory glance at this is that this is actually completely backwards, and that the majority of international policy academic people subscribe to some form of realism. Mm-hmm. So I think Destiny is completely wrong here. But
well, good.
Like to talk about, I think I called him Mearsheimer. Mearsheimer's analysis of like the state of security in 1990 and onwards from Europe. He's written a lot of essays about it. He wrote a huge one, like a 50-page paper in 1990 predicting the future state of security in Europe. It was garbage. It was horrible. His predictions that Europe would descend into constant anarchy, that countries like Japan and the United States would be looking to vie for interest here, that every country would be rearming because that's what realist countries do. It just totally and completely missed the mark. I don't think anybody takes those predictions seriously in terms of this is how countries will act. So I don't know if it's appropriate to go forward into the future when he's already failed to make successful predictions of what has really been a relatively peaceful period for 30 years in Europe, and then try to say that this frame of analysis is what we're going to use going forward when it comes to dealing with Ukraine and Russia. And then again, what's more to reiterate for the 50 millionth time, all of these realist arguments, if we are to accept them, justifies NATO including Ukraine and being aggressive towards Russia just as much as it does Russia taking over Ukraine and I guess establishing security around its own borders. But again, I mean, I can ask you again, and I know that we'll kind of dance around again, like NATO has not shown itself to be aggressive towards Russia. The most and best you can possibly say is that there are surface-to-surface missile bases in some of these NATO countries, but I mean, what? Like honestly, do you really believe that NATO countries are going to start launching missiles into Moscow? Like, do you really believe that, or is this something you're worried 20 or 30 years from now? Or do you think that the investment into ABM technology is going to become so good that, at some point we did it, guys, we beat second strike capability, time to just nuke the hell out of Russia? That sounds fantastical to me. Now, maybe we can imagine a world where that happens, but I can't use that imaginary world to justify the invasion, destruction of civilian cities, and the takeover of a sovereign nation that exists today in the real world. That would be insane to me. That sort of justification can be used for Russia to invade literally any neighbor that they could perceive in 30 years to be a threat because of technology that doesn't exist yet. I just think that's absolutely insane. Russia doesn't have justification for invading Ukraine. The future hypothetical threats to Russian sovereignty can't be used as an invasion to another sovereign country that's not in violation of any UN resolution.
Why not?
That's not because it just doesn't, because that could be used to justify the invasion of almost any state in the world by any great power.
No,
why not?
Because Russia wouldn't say Mexico is going to deploy surface-to-surface missiles that can hit us in 5 minutes, and a NATO base in the Black Sea displaces our Russian base. So no.
Sure, the United States could invade places in Venezuela or Brazil or Colombia.
Countries.
No, it could apply to...
The argument that Russia's making applies to exactly...
Well, no, that's not even really true. It would apply to Poland. It would apply to Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia. It applied to all these countries that are NATO members already.
Only 2 countries.
The United States could invade Cuba right now if they wanted to, using that argument.
Yeah. Yes, and they would. And
But we don't. So your realist perspective fails.
Did. The Bay of Pigs. The Bay of Pigs.
They
the Bay of Pigs.
legitimately didn't. That's why the Bay of Pigs
He's so
failed.
excited.
Right?
I know.
Right. The
Failed
United States
because
did not successfully invade.
It
Do you
failed
think
because they were incompetent, but they tried.
Oh, because they were incompetent. The United States
Yeah.
failed an invasion in Cuba
If
because they were
Russia
incompetent.
fails,
It's because
are
they
you going to
lacked.
say, oh, they didn't invade?
Compare again, as we said earlier, comparing the Bay of Pigs to this to Russia going to Ukraine is so horribly dishonest.
Yeah.
No comparison.
How many people are involved in the Bay of Pigs? Because there's 140,000 Russian troops in Ukraine right now.
It's a good question.
I mean, they talk about wasn't it like 20 guys or something? They did like a
it says
amphibious landing or something.
Units involved. I don't know, because I mean, it was like, it was just like 90, 9% of it was Cubans. So, there wasn't.
Right.
The American military, like in Ukraine, the Russian military rolls up and invades. The United States military did not roll up and invade Cuba and then just fail and then give up. That is not even remotely close to what happened.
1,400 Cuban exiles launched what became a botched invasion at the Bay of Pigs on the south coast of Cuba. So they were Cuban exiles.
Right. So 14,000 Cuban exiles.
Mm-hmm.
So that's comparable to Russia invading with its military in Ukraine.
Yeah, 100 times the size. It's
all right.
Convenient.
Okay.
If Russia fails in this Ukraine war, are you going to say, "Oh, well, that just didn't happen because it
if
didn't
the
work"?
United States played by Russia's rules, we would invade Cuba right now. We already have, I think, Guantanamo Bay isn't.
No,
Southeastern
because
Europe.
there's no Russian defensive alliance in Cuba, and there's no surface-to-surface
Wait, hold on.
missiles
That
in
doesn't
Cuba.
matter from your
Cuba's
realist.
not talking about nuclear rearmament.
That doesn't.
And if they were, we would invade because we did.
That,
in Bay of Pigs, and we almost went to nuclear war over the Cuban Missile Crisis.
That doesn't fit your realist
So
perspective,
over.
Nick. Whether or not Cuba has those
So
arms, I would
over.
just repeat back to you that strong
like
nations seek
declaring
to exert
victory
their
here.
influence over weak nations. Cuba is a weak nation next to the United States. Why don't we just invade them and take them over? That's what Russia would do.
Because they're not putting surface-to-surface missiles there. There's not a defensive alliance
cares?
there. Cuba is pacified because Cuba
You
is
already
completely pacified.
No, you already admitted
Cuba
to me.
poses
You
no.
already admitted to me that
Cuba
even if
poses
NATO
no
was
threat.
off the table, Russia would still seek to exert influence over Ukraine. It might
They
even
would
still take over
influence. They would
Sevastopol. It might
influence.
still, which might be
influence.
taking Crimea, right?
In the same way that we influence Cuba. And
That's
we
not the same way. We don't
countries.
send militaries down there to take over ports in Cuba. We don't send.
But now you're just trying to confuse here. Which is it? I mean, we're talking about Russia influencing Ukraine absent the military alliance. And now I'm saying, well, they influenced Cuba. And you're saying, well, they're not invading. It's like, okay, well, Russia didn't invade until the defensive alliance was on the table. And Crimea
the defensive alliance was on the table until Crimea was taken over.
Because NATO membership was on the table after the Maidan. Hello? And 13 countries.
This isn't true. I wish
none
you
of this
pushed
is
on
true.
us.
Yeah.
After 2014, there was no talk all of a sudden that Ukraine was going to be fast tracked into NATO. That did not occur.
2008.
Yeah, that was in 2008. That didn't
Yeah.
occur after 2014.
Yeah.
And as Destiny brought up, and as even Nick brought up, that wouldn't even occur because NATO does not accept members that are currently engaged in territorial disputes, which Ukraine after 2014 was engaged in a territorial dispute with Russia, including a fucking civil war that Russia was backing.
Right.
So this is...
He keeps defaulting back to the
right.
NATO. It's America's fault because NATO.
Right.
Which is just not true, but...
Z, absolutely. I support what's going on. And I think that it's defensible. I think that this is the most reasonable European war that has happened in the past 100 years. I think this is the most reasonable war in the 21st century. Absolutely. I think, and to give you a comparison, I think this is more justifiable than the American war in Iraq. I think this is more justifiable than the NATO intervention in Libya. I think it's more justifiable than the American war in Afghanistan, frankly. I think this is a completely reasonable conflict. And, the argument seems to be like, well, war is always wrong, and national sovereignty is the sacred thing, except for when it isn't, except for when war is justified, and except for when sovereignty.
Well, beyond this being whataboutism, it's very rich to say when the Afghan government is funding terrorists that attack America in the largest terrorist attack in our fucking history, that is less justified attacking them than Russia deciding to attack Ukraine because they already attacked Ukraine and Ukraine was mad about it and they weren't getting over it.
Yeah.
Okay.
They didn't roll over hard enough.
Right.
Sovereignty is conditional. Just that you arbitrarily decide the terms based on
they're not arbitrary. They're international courts. The UN,
the Western world system, right? I mean, when you talk about they're international norms or something, invading Iraq wasn't based on international norms. The world opposed that. France didn't even support that. Okay, France didn't even support the war in Iraq, but the United States pursued it and how more people died in Iraq than have died in Ukraine
so far.
And we occupied Iraq for 20 years, and there wasn't this boycott. There wasn't I stand with fucking Iraq, and nobody talked about Saddam Hussein's sovereignty. So I mean, just give it a rest. I mean, America's a global hegemon. We project power globally, soft and hard power. Russia is second-rate, regional power, and they're exerting.
I guess he's talking about total, because if you just talk about U.S., the U.S. lost 4,431 troops in Iraq.
Yeah,
total.
Way more Iraqis.
Right. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. He must be
like
talking about
100,000 Iraqis.
Right, but from Russia's already lost that in Ukraine.
And people did talk about Iraqi sovereignty. There were a lot of people against the war in Iraq.
There was a lot
talking about.
And the people that were against the war in Iraq in America, they didn't go to jail.
Yeah. And they protested based on Iraqi sovereignty.
The crux of the argument is this. America is not a benign hegemon. America is the world superpower. And with NATO is a hyperpower still. $1.2 trillion in military spending, more sophisticated capability than anybody can recognize. And all it takes is to put yourselves in the shoes of the Russians and in Moscow to understand where Russia is coming from. The suspension of the ABM Treaty in 2001, the suspension of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty in 2019, these in themselves are dramatic provocations. The reintroduction of theater support missiles into Europe destabilizes the balance of power. And that is, of course, notwithstanding the largest concern, which is the continued expansion of NATO since 1999. NATO is an explicitly anti-Russian alliance. It's formed to contain Russia and principally to contain Russian influence and power. After the Soviet Union dissolved and Russia became weaker, NATO remained and expanded. And now it's expanding on Russia's borders, compromising its vital strategic interests, its naval base in Crimea, its Black Sea Fleet, and the territory of Ukraine. What NATO membership for Ukraine entails is surface-to-surface missiles, which can strike Russia in 5 minutes. It entails a tripwire in Ukraine that is right on Russia's border. It entails NATO domination of the Black Sea. And ultimately, this is about NATO and American domination of its adversaries and no concession given to its adversaries that they might have legitimate security interests. They might have legitimate interests as powerful states and all, and recognizing that and negotiating with them and working with them towards an equitable security arrangement. That's what we're talking about here, is an equitable and fair security arrangement. Destiny has talked about sovereignty, which, of course, we know the United States considers conditional. When Russia invades Ukraine, it's a gross violation of sovereignty. But when we invade Libya, Iraq, and bomb other countries, of course, these exceptions are valid. It's called right to protect. We can fabricate this out of thin air. We say that Ukraine has a right to self-determination, but it is true that the United States backed the Maidan Revolution. That could be disputed, but nevertheless, we support that government. We've given billions of dollars in assistance to that coup government, and we've supported that coup government's aspirations to join NATO. So once again, self-determination appears to be somewhat conditional. And then what's more fundamentally about all of this, this is a bad outcome. This is a bad outcome that nobody wanted. How did we arrive here? What were the root causes and the precipitating causes? Let's even just be fair and say, at the minimum, we have to recognize that the United States has played a role in this. To say that it is all Russian revanchism belies the military imbalance, which is very real. It belies Russia's capabilities and the fact that in 22 years of rule, Vladimir Putin has not taken over any countries, invaded any sovereign countries. It was in response to the 2014 crisis and in response to the suggestion that Ukraine might go nuclear and join NATO that Russia invaded Ukraine. How did we arrive here? We have to look at our own role. We have to look at our own role in disrupting the mutually...
Didn't he invade Georgia? Yeah,
they invaded, of course. But
He's saying Putin didn't invade any other country.
I know. I just figured we've said this a million times.
Okay, gotcha.
Sure,
Every time
destruction,
Nick says the same
confidence
We're like, wrap it up.
Yeah.
with the ABM and the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty withdrawal. We have to recognize our role destabilizing other countries around the world with NATO aggression. We have to recognize our role in expanding NATO in a way that Russia's repeatedly said makes them uncomfortable, and even where they've drawn red lines. And so, if my victory condition in the debate is merely for people to say NATO played a part and Russia has some valid interest here, I think we cover that. I think I won on those grounds. The other side has to say that America is a benign hegemon. The world wants American power. The world invites American power. American power is innocuous. Russia has nothing to fear. Russia has no valid concerns. It's just run by a corrupt despot who's only using security concerns as a pretext for territorial ambitions. I think throughout the debate that was made, I think from the outset, that was conceded not to be true. So that's my closing statement. America is not a benign hegemon. This is a limited, reasonable military engagement, certainly more reasonable than the things NATO has done in this century. And I support Russia. Go Russia! We salute the brave soldiers, the Moscow's finest, the Tsar's finest, as they liberate Ukraine from the Western dogs. So that's my closing statement. Z.
I will concede the entire debate to Nick of whether or not America is a benign hegemon. Unfortunately, that is not at all what we came here to talk about today. I understand that when Russia is in the process of invading another country, they very much want to center the conversation about Russian-American relationships or about the sovereignty of the United States or the sovereignty of Russia or the way that these two superpowers act, but that is not what the discussion is about today. It's whether or not Russia's invasion into Ukraine can be justified. We can bring up as many defeated talking points as we want. I'm used to people doing it over and over and over again. We can talk about how the suspension of some ABM treaty magically destroys second strike capabilities, even though when Nick was pushed, he admitted that an ABM silo cannot become an ICBM silo. He admitted that Putin was allowed access to these silos by Biden if he wanted to investigate. He admitted that this technology that Putin is so worried about doesn't even exist yet. It might not be here for 10, 20, or 30 years. And he admitted that if this technology was so threatening, who cares? We could install it just as easily in Poland, Romania, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, down in Turkey. If we wanted to nuke Russia from anywhere, if we wanted to encircle Russia from anywhere, if we wanted to have ABM silos around the world that could intercept an infinite amount of MIRVs, an infinite amount of ICBMs, we could already do it. We don't need Ukraine to do that. Just like Nick already admitted that even if Ukraine never even had an accession plan to NATO, Russia, in the realist perspective, would just invade them anyway. They have a right to it. Why? Because of strategic interest in the Black Sea that Turkey is constantly threatening anyway. Controlling Sevastopol doesn't get them through Istanbul, doesn't get them into the Mediterranean. There isn't even a good strategic reason around the world why Russia would have access to these ports, how it would help them. And the idea that capturing Ukraine, the idea that Russia invading Ukraine is representing the same threat to their sovereignty as Ukraine democratically choosing to join the NATO alliance, the idea that America is this benign hegemony and they've never done anything and blah, 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 that's absolutely not true. I've never said it. But there is the fact that there is an old Eastern European saying that if you call for America, America will come. If you call for Russia, Russia will come. And if you call for no one, Russia will come. There is something to be said for the fact that these countries, whether we're talking the Baltics, whether we're talking Poland, Romania, any Southeastern Europe, there is the fact that these countries are looking towards NATO and they want to join NATO. Their citizens are voting to join NATO. We can't even accept just one or two at a time. It always have to be in batches of 3, 4, or 5 because we don't want to accept only one because it'll cause conflict in the countries because people are so desperate to get into our military alliance. And the only thing that Russia has done with their continued aggression into Ukraine has proven today more than ever a good reason why that alliance still exists. And that's to ensure the security of your country if you are not willing to pursue a nuclear arms program of your own. So I would prefer a world where NATO expands to include more countries than the world that Nick advocates for, where Russia has justification to invade anybody they want, and the only successful path forward if you are a smaller country is to acquire nuclear weapons of your own.
That is the essential point here, which I don't feel like the pro-Russian apologia side has ever addressed, which is that if you say that if NATO disappears from the world, basically the only option that Eastern European countries have is to become nuclear powers, which Russia's going to invade them and they're not going to let that happen anyway.
Yeah. So
it's just a preposterous solution. Did you want to, or is it too late, or did you want to watch the, I don't know how long it is.
We should go. We should wrap it up.
We should wrap it up?
Yeah.
Okay. Anyway, thank you so much for incredibly generous donations. Thank you for all the people that joined our new channel memberships. Now that we have new members, I believe we can start putting in even more and different and new emojis. So that'll be fun. Thank you for those that stuck with us through this very long conversation. I hope you enjoyed it, even if it was frustrating to listen to at some points. Thank you, Sargon, for coming on, even though it got heated in the beginning. No, seriously, even though it got heated in the beginning, I'm really glad we had the conversation. I thought it was very interesting, and I hope it was informative to everyone. We don't want to just be, the echo chamber here. So it's good to have opposing views and people that disagree with us on. Anyway, hope you all have a fantastic Monday, and we'll see you on Tuesday.
Bye-bye! Hi, you just listened to a clip from the Sitch and Adams show. If you like what you heard, you can listen to our live show right here on this channel on Sunday, starting at 1 p.m. Pacific, 4 p.m. Eastern. And if you want, you can super chat us. We read $20 and up super chats on the show and then do a follow-up stream on the following Tuesday where we read the rest of the unread super chats and interact with fans of the show. Subscribe to this channel right here to listen to the live show or to listen to more of our awesome clips.